While we listen to tunes made by ignorant fools, Israel blocked the UN from delivering food. They bring in the troops and you won't even glimpse at the news. They make money off the products that we create to consume. And it's not simply a question of different views. Forget emotions, this is facts, what I spit is the truth.
I think that a lot of information that we have now is quite difficult to really get our heads around in terms of directly drawing conclusions from it. What I will say is that throughout history we have seen that the British Intelligence Service have a method of engaging with destabilizations in different parts of the world. But moreover, we saw Peter Oborn's article in the Daily Mail, which I'm sure many people have seen, clearly drawing a contradiction in MI5 policy and MI6 policy. And talking about the facilitations, and not only the facilitations of people who are frustrated politically in the countries that they come from, but moreover the weaponization of them and the training of them, and the way that that then has an effect in terms of building a blowback onto the society where people have left or where people have come from. I think there's a real lack of cognizance not only about British current foreign policy and arms deals in general, but also the legacy of the British Empire. When you had a entity which by 1914 was occupying 12,700,000 miles of the planet in a non-contiguous empire, you have legacies of dissent, you have legacies of pain and definitely built up resentment towards this idea of Britain resting upon the vestiges of colonialism and using that to interact with other parts of the world and with other people. The neoliberal era has seen a time when we can clearly see that nothing is too valuable to be sacrificed at the crucible of short-term accumulation of capital, whereby, for instance, and this is a very interesting example where the pronounced foreign policy on the side of Britain and the actual practical realities of what was happening, clearly they came apart, they diverged. There was a company called Churchill Matrix in the 90s, a Coventry-based engineering firm, which at that time, following the war in Kuwait, were selling military hardware to the Iraqi government. At that time, there was a boycott on the selling of military hardware to them. Now, what followed was a court case whereby the directors of the company were, they sought prosecution of them. In that process, it came out that number one, conservative ministers had of course signed off on those weapons deals, but moreover, those directors were themselves in the pay of British intelligence services. So here we see quite a convoluted, essentially Iran-Contra-esque arrangement whereby one thing is being said publicly, but on the other hand, clearly the march of industry is considered to be far more important than any other considerations. In terms of more contemporary issues, you know, the selling of 3.3 billion, the last data indicated 3.3 billion worth of military hardware to the Saudis since the beginning of the intervention in Yemen, which you have 80% of the population essentially on the brink of starvation. You have over 14 million people because of the naval and air blockade without access to clean water. You have, you know, a very ancient civilization, Hadramaut, is considered the home of Qahtan or Adnan. This has great significance for the history of Arabic-speaking people. Essentially, is being destroyed really in a campaign which is targeting civilians, which is bombing hospitals, bombing schools, use of double tap, whereby one strike is made and then the ambulance arrives and they are also struck. And you know, Philip Hammond at the beginning of the campaign, he said, we will do everything with the exception of taking part in combat ourselves to support Saudi efforts in Yemen. And so this not only contributes to resentment against Britain, and you know, one of the interesting parts of this equation, Hannah Arendt wrote the book The Banality of Evil, and in it she talks about the forgetfulness and the ability to forget the humanness of the person that's being destroyed by this process. And what we have is a campaign essentially of demobilization of the public by the corporate media. And again, this talks back to Sheldon Wallen's theory of inverted totalitarianism, whereby people are able to vote for episodic political leaders, but they were not given the opportunity previous to now to vote against the interests of BAE systems. You know, and the arms industry is an industry which is subsidized by the taxpayer. You have when a country, a government for instance, would renege on its payments or default on its payments for an arms deal, that then will be covered by the taxpayer. So that will be subsidized. You know, and all of these issues are very important, but there's a real lack of cognizance about it within the society. You know, studies were done saying only 49% of the public know about the war in Yemen, and for a situation that in some ways we play such a pivotal and vital role in, and our representatives play a vital role in, it's quite unfortunate that we are not partaking in activities that are based on disruption, civil disobedience, finding different ways for us to step and put displace the cogs within the machine of this industry, which wreaks such havoc and despair and, you know, unquantifiable ramifications on people's lives. You know, when you look at the way that the first usage of aerial bombardment was 1911 with the Italians bombing Tripoli in Libya, and from that point onwards you saw a real change in the way that human beings were targeted. So previously to that, most wars had been fought on fronts, and most people that died in war, they died from starvation due to blockades, due to sieges. What it changed was it changed the idea of the combatant, because now civilians could be targeted. It was perceived to be cost effective to have planes do missions, not just reconnaissance missions, but missions whereby they target people. You didn't have to commit armies to the area. Also the sort of dronization of war that we've seen over the past few decades as well as part of this. But what it allowed is it allowed a depersonalization between the person committing the act and the person dying. Howard Zinn, I found Howard Zinn's stories about his experience in the Second World War quite fascinating. He was a fighter pilot at that time, and he talked about the way that he had no way of understanding what it was that he was doing to people because he was so high up in the sky. And you compare that to, say, the experience of someone like Oliver Stone, who fought on the ground in the Vietnam War and is completely aware of the reality of his actions. And he saw, you know, with Howard Zinn, it wasn't until he read a book about Hiroshima really that he was able to get to grips with actually what he'd been part of. You know, you look on the other side, someone like Brandon Bryant, who's a former drone operator, who watched people die on the screen in front of him, and his job was not to fire the shots himself, but it was to fix the target. You know, and as he said, he watched children die. And I think there's something in that kind of impotent voyeurism and that kind of spectatorship of suffering, which it causes real disconnect and discord within the human being, and it wreaks havoc on our conscience. You look at, say, for instance, Nobel, who invented dynamite originally for construction purposes, and you know, many say that it was his guilt over that made him come forward with the Nobel Prizes, etc. Oppenheimer, the Manhattan Project, which of course, you know, we know. Not only this was another thing that actually changes the nature of a combatant, because nuclear and obviously the releasing of this plutonium into that, you know, we don't know what that did to the world, but also, moreover, the bombing of people in this way, when things have a half-life of several billion years, for example, and the damage will people will continue to be born with defects and with deformities from this, it clearly changes the idea of the combatant, because then is the child that's going to be born in 10 years suddenly a combatant also? This is the nature of modern warfare. This is the nature of these increasingly sophisticated methods of murder. And I think we live in quite an interesting time in that way, because we've been afforded a death of distance, as it were, and a death of geography, in that we can have a more omnipotent relationship with information. We have access to information as never before, at no point in the human race anyone has ever had, but we're also the most spied upon, the most targeted for commercial, in the most marketized and commercialized civilization that has ever existed throughout human history. We're part of it. So all of these things together, they form quite an interesting relationship. And I think that, you know, the sophistication of weaponry is, and the sophistication in these methods of killing, is something that we have to answer to that brutality, you know, and I think it's a moral obligation.
Makes no difference if you're a Christian or if you're a Jew. They're just people living in different conditions to you. They still die when you bomb this.
The reason for these obfuscations that we have heard in recent times regarding support for governments which, by their own admission, by the British government's own standards and categorizations, are, you know, 22 of the 30 biggest human rights violators, according to the British government that is, are supplied with weaponry by the British, by BAE Systems. Now, often the argument used is that cooperation with these governments keeps people here safe in terms of intelligence relationships. The truth of the matter is that this government is servile to corporate interest, and it is those sales, you know, that number one lead to a situation where you have the Saudis having more British-made planes than the British themselves, where you have the Saudis using cluster bombs, which were manufactured by the British in the 80s, despite them being outlawed in 2008, and you have the chairman of BAE Systems refusing to say whether the planes have been adapted in order for that cluster bomb usage. This equation is about the buttressing of the arms industry, which, as I said before, is subsidized by the British taxpayer. So these are people that, even within the tortured logic of the mythology of patriotism, are treasonous, and they are perfectly willing to submit, you know, the imagined community of this country to corporate vassalage. And that's what this is about. It's about economics, as they see it, trumping politics.
Mosques and hospitals, it's not because of rockets, please God, can you stop this all? I'm not related to the strangers on the TV, but I relate, because those strangers couldn't.
Well, austerity is an ideological choice. Joseph Stiglitz, for example, has articulated in a far more erudite way than I would ever be able to, that austerity causes more inequality. And this neoliberal period that we were born into has been about Robin Hood policies in reverse, so redistributions of wealth upwards. And throughout history, we have seen different ways of industrializing the murder of poor people. And this is the quintessential example of the industrialization of the murder of poor people. So when they talk about it being a massive source for jobs, they talk about the arms industry. Generally, as far as my understanding is, the numbers of people employed are vastly over-exaggerated by them. In reality, as far as I understand, the number of people employed within the arms industry, well, within BAE Systems, if I'm correct, is closer to 100,000 than the 200, 300,000 that they play with. But moreover, this idea that we have money to subsidize the taxpayer without any, and this comes back again to the inverted totalitarianism of it. We don't have the choice to vote for the subsidizing of BAE systems. We don't have that choice. Now, with this election coming up, is the first time that I think we may. And I think that's why it's important that people mobilize in that way. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't still seek to disrupt through acts of civil disobedience and direct action this harmful industry which causes such suffering. But yeah, you see the juxtaposition of that never being questioned, it never being a make or break part of the discussion in terms of policies coming up to elections. I mean, it is slightly, but if anything, it's so skewed the other way. But at the same time, you see the cuts that take place and the privatization of essential state functions and public services being something that they are very quick to pursue. And this is about liberalism taking the place of the dominant economic philosophy in this country and in the United States through the 80s, off the back of the 70s.
Words could never ever explain the raw tragedy. It's not a war, they're just murdering more rapidly, and we're automatically supporting.
So unfortunately, recent events, horrifying, tragic events, have, number one, revealed a duality and exposed the duality in present government policy, but also they have vindicated the discourse and vindicated the anti-war movement's ideas around 2003. We saw the largest mobilization against the war in the history of the human species, essentially, in 2003. And what was being said is that the pursuit of these policies will lead to less security for people within these borders. Not only will it massively increase alienation and estrangement and emphasize difference between societies, and also, as I said before, have unquantifiable ramifications, it would lead to less security here. Now, the idea that is being put forth by this government and has been put forth by most of the options that we've had politically have been that security is intimately and connected in an umbilical way to the building up of defense. This is what I would call for from any forthcoming government. But also, I again would implore anyone watching this to partake in acts of civil disobedience, acts of direct action, to disrupt this industry which is causing such pain.
Free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine, free, free Palestine.